The name Bluebeard sends chills down the spines of those familiar with French history. His story is one of the most terrifying and haunting tales to emerge from the annals of crime. The mere mention of his name evokes images of dark, foggy streets and the lurking presence of a predator in the shadows. He was a monster who preyed on innocent women, leaving a trail of death and despair in his wake. These women, often vulnerable and seeking a better life, fell victim to his sinister charm and deceitful promises. The aftermath of his crimes left families shattered and communities in mourning. His crimes shocked the nation, shattering any illusion of safety and security. The headlines screamed of his atrocities, and the public was gripped by fear and outrage. The sheer brutality of his actions was incomprehensible, and the nation was left to grapple with the horror of his deeds. The name Bluebeard became synonymous with betrayal, cruelty, and the darkest impulses of human nature. He embodied the very essence of evil, a figure who thrived on the suffering of others. His story serves as a grim reminder of the capacity for darkness that exists within the human soul. Like the villain of the fairy tale from which he drew his nickname, Bluebeard lured his victims with charm and promises of a better life. He was a master of deception, using his charisma to mask his true intentions. His victims, blinded by hope and trust, were led into a trap from which there was no escape. He was a master manipulator, able to gain the trust of those he intended to harm. His ability to present himself as a savior or benefactor made him all the more dangerous. The betrayal felt by his victims was profound, as they realized too late the true nature of the man they had trusted. His crimes were always calculated, his methods cold and brutal. He planned each act with meticulous detail, ensuring that his victims had no chance of escape. The precision with which he executed his plans was chilling, leaving investigators baffled and horrified. But who was the man behind the mask? What kind of person could commit such heinous acts without a shred of remorse? The mystery of Bluebeard's true identity only added to the terror he inspired. What drove him to commit such unspeakable acts? Was it a troubled past, a twisted mind, or something even more sinister? The psychological profile of Bluebeard reveals a complex and deeply disturbed individual, whose motivations remain a subject of speculation and study. And how did his reign of terror finally come to an end? The relentless pursuit by law enforcement, the courage of those who dared to speak out, and the eventual capture and trial of Bluebeard brought a sense of justice to his victims. The courtroom became a stage for the final act of his dark saga. This is the story of France's Bluebeard, a tale of horror, justice, and the enduring fascination with true crime. It is a story that continues to captivate and horrify, a reminder of the depths of human depravity and the resilience of those who seek justice. The shadow of Bluebeard lingers, a dark chapter in history that will never be forgotten. While the details of Bluebeard's early life remain shrouded in mystery, certain facts are known. Born into a world of hardship and struggle, his early years were anything but easy. He was born into poverty in rural France at the turn of the century. The village where he grew up was small and isolated, a place where everyone knew each other, yet secrets were buried deep. Life was hard, and his childhood was marked by neglect and possibly abuse. The harsh realities of his environment left little room for joy or innocence. The children in his village often went hungry, and the adults were too preoccupied with their own survival to offer much comfort or guidance. Some speculate that these early experiences planted the seeds of anger and resentment that would later blossom into violence. The isolation and neglect he faced could have fostered a deep-seated rage, a feeling of being wronged by the world that he would carry with him into adulthood. As a young man, Bluebeard drifted from town to town, taking on odd jobs and always staying one step ahead of the law. His transient lifestyle made it difficult for anyone to truly know him, and he preferred it that way. Each new town was a fresh start, a place where he could reinvent himself and leave his past behind. He was described by those who knew him as quiet, even charming, but with a darkness lurking beneath the surface. His charm was a mask, a tool he used to manipulate those around him. People were drawn to his enigmatic presence, unaware of the sinister thoughts that lay hidden behind his calm exterior. It was during this period that he likely began to hone the skills that would later make him a successful predator. His ability to blend in, to gain the trust of others, and to disappear without a trace. He learned to read people, to understand their weaknesses and exploit them to his advantage. His ability to vanish when things got too complicated made him a ghost, a phantom that haunted the memories of those he left behind. These skills, combined with his growing capacity for cruelty, would soon transform him into the monster known as Bluebeard. His early life, filled with hardship and neglect, had forged a man capable of unimaginable horrors. The world would come to know him as a predator, but those who looked closely could see the broken child that still lurked within, a child who had learned to survive by becoming the very thing he feared most. Bluebeard's first confirmed victim was a young woman who had come to the city looking for work. She was full of hope and dreams, like many others who flocked to the urban centers in search of a better life. The city, with its promise of opportunity, was a beacon for those seeking to escape the hardships of rural life. She was last seen alive in his company. Bluebeard, with his charming demeanor, had a way of gaining the trust of his victims. He often presented himself as a helpful and trustworthy individual, someone who could offer guidance and support to those new to the city. Her disappearance might have gone unnoticed, another lost soul in the urban sprawl, but for a gruesome discovery made by chance. The city was a labyrinth of alleys and hidden corners where the vulnerable could easily vanish without a trace. Weeks later, her body was found buried in the basement of a building where Bluebeard had been employed as a handyman. The discovery was made by a tenant who had noticed a foul odor emanating from the basement. Upon investigation, the police uncovered a scene of horror that would haunt the city for years to come. She had been brutally murdered. The details of the crime were so horrific that they were initially withheld from the public to avoid causing widespread panic. However, word soon spread, and the city was engulfed in fear and outrage. The brutality of the crime sent shockwaves through the city. Newspapers ran sensational headlines, and the story dominated conversations in homes, workplaces, and public spaces. The once bustling city now seemed shrouded in a cloud of dread. Police began to connect the dots, linking this murder to other missing women, all of whom had crossed paths with Bluebeard. The investigation revealed a pattern of disappearances that had previously gone unnoticed. Each new piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of a calculated and cold-blooded killer. As the body count rose, so did the fear. The city was gripped by a sense of vulnerability, as it became clear that the killer could strike again at any moment. The police worked tirelessly, but the sheer scale of the investigation was overwhelming. Women were afraid to leave their homes alone. The streets, once filled with the sounds of daily life, now echoed with the silence of fear. Social gatherings dwindled, and the nightlife that had once been a hallmark of the city came to a standstill. Parents kept their daughters close. Families took extra precautions, and the sense of community that had once been a source of strength now felt like a fragile shield against an unseen threat. The city was gripped by a collective sense of terror. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat, and every stranger was viewed with suspicion. The fear was palpable, and it affected every aspect of daily life. Bluebeard had become a bogeyman, his name whispered in hushed tones. Stories of his deeds were passed around like ghost stories, each retelling adding to the myth and the fear. He was no longer just a man, he had become a symbol of the darkest aspects of human nature, a reminder of the evil that could lurk behind a friendly face. The clock is ticking, a timeline of terror. 1905. Bluebeard is born in rural France. 1920. He moves to the city, taking on various odd jobs. 1928. The first confirmed victim disappears. 1929. Her body is discovered. Police begin to suspect Bluebeard. 1930 to 1933. A series of women go missing, all linked to Bluebeard. 1934. Police finally apprehend Bluebeard after a desperate struggle. This timeline represents just a fraction of the crimes attributed to Bluebeard. It is believed that many more victims remain undiscovered, their stories lost to time. The mind of a monster, delving into depravity. Criminologists and psychologists have long been fascinated by the case of Bluebeard. What drove this seemingly ordinary man to commit such horrific acts? Was he a product of his environment, warped by a difficult childhood? Or was he born evil, a psychopath incapable of empathy or remorse? Some experts point to Bluebeard's troubled upbringing as a contributing factor. Others focus on his apparent lack of remorse and his cold, calculating nature as evidence of psychopathy. Whatever the explanation, there is no doubt that Bluebeard was a deeply disturbed individual, driven by a perverse need for power and control. Justice at last, the capture of Bluebeard. For years, Bluebeard operated with impunity, his crimes becoming bolder and more brazen. But his luck finally ran out. A near victim, suspicious of his advances, reported him to the police. They were finally able to track him down to a seedy boarding house on the outskirts of the city. The arrest was not without drama. Bluebeard resisted violently, injuring 2 officers before being subdued. The capture of the notorious Bluebeard sent a collective sigh of relief through the city and the nation. The monster who had haunted their nightmares was finally behind bars.